Noswaith, good evening, and welcome to our final Double Vision session of the current run. Over the last 8 months, it has been a delight to discuss topics from death and discrimination to hope and humour, as we've heard from friends from a diverse range of political and religious outlooks who have generously shared their experience and expertise with us. The aim was always that we might listen to and learn from those with whom sometimes we might not otherwise encounter, always hearing two different perspectives on an issue and perhaps leaving the dialogue with a less finely cut but more well-rounded view of things. Tonight we end our current series with a bang as we look at the ism that Oscar Wilde deemed the virtue of the vicious, patriotism. So here is a question to get us started. Land of hope and glory, mother of the free, how shall we extol thee who are born of thee? I think Bethan's face might say it all. For some of us here tonight, those words might evoke stirring memories of flags flying and crowds bobbing as Elgar's composition rings out across the Royal Albert Hall or perhaps Singleton or Hyde Park. For others of us, those words might stick in the throat as the anthem of the empire, evoking the days when a third of the world was pink, and with a flag, a Bible and a gun, whole territories were colonized for king and country. Such was the dilemma last September, when Boris and the BBC enjoyed a war of words over whether that song and the accompanying Rule Britannia should be sung at the last night of the proms. That dialogue was part of the wider discussion about British colonial history, which resurfaced in the light of the Black Lives Matter protests, which swept across the world following the murder of George Floyd, but which has quite nicely all been sorted on these shores with the publication of the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities report published a fortnight ago, which concluded that the United Kingdom should be regarded as a model for other white majority countries. Not everyone was convinced. In fact, the divisions that the report's findings exposed and exacerbated are grounded in the wider disagreements over whether or not one can be proud of one's country, proud of being British or Welsh or English. So we have Remainers versus Brexiteers, Loyalists versus Republicans, Team Meghan versus Team Royals. The question of whether you should or can be proud or ashamed of, loyal or indifferent to your homeland and country fuels international conflict and tabloid psychodrama from Holyrood to Hollywood. And next month's UK-wide elections are increasingly viewed through this lens. There are those who would want to point to patriotism as the root cause of union-splitting jingoism, anti-immigration populism, and even the resurgence of the far right and its palingenetic ultra-fascist tendencies, and who would therefore agree with Voltaire's assertion that it is lamentable that to be a good patriot, one must be an enemy of the rest of mankind. Others would characterize such a view as oversimplistic nonsense. But what's wrong with having some pride in where you come from? Why shouldn't Voltaire's contemporary siblings be proud of the French ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity? Is it a sin for an Englishman to celebrate the country that gave the world the Beatles and the Bard, the Magna Carta and the World Wide Web? And can a Welsh woman not be proud of her land and language, or of the fact that the whole of the British Isles was once Tredegarized with the rollout of the NHS? Is patriotism perhaps more about principles than power? More about solidarity in Wales than elitism in Westminster? And is pride in country counter to faith in Christ? What really are the positives and pitfalls of patriotism? Well, to guide us through this quagmire of questions and offer their thoughts on the subject and its surrounding issues, we have two outstanding guest speakers tonight. First of all, we welcome Llywelyn ap Gwilym, the son of a Ponty girl and the founder of AUOB Cymru, all under one banner, Cymru. Llywelyn was the head organizer of the rallies that attracted thousands across Wales, including some here tonight, back in 2019. Not content with getting us marching on the streets, he's recently got us dreaming about the future with his The Black Book of the New Wales, described by Dan Evans from the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research and Data as an exciting blueprint for building a better society. The Black Book mixes utopian thinking with pragmatic suggestions for how a prosperous and fair, sustainable and kind Wales could be created. So Llywelyn, it's a privilege to have you here this evening, and we really look forward to what you're going to bring us. Our second speaker this evening is a Baptist minister, university chaplain and biblical author whose preaching and published work ring out with a passion for a fairer, more just society. And so we welcome Ray Vincent. And those of us who are blessed to know Ray will tell you not to be fooled or lulled into false pretenses by his gentle nature and good humour, for his theology is sharp and honest, radical and hopeful. It was little surprise to many then that in his 80s, Ray's commitment to challenging prejudice and championing an inclusive faith saw him named as Stonewall's Role Model of the Year in 2019. Tonight, Ray will be shining a light on the issue of patriotism from a Christian viewpoint. And we remember there are many different Christian viewpoints on this, as always. And we are thrilled to have you here to do just that, Ray. So welcome to you too. So before I hand over to our esteemed guests, a quick reminder of the process this evening. And to those of us on YouTube, you may or may not have, you may or may not be there because of issues with links, but if you are here, whether Zoom or on YouTube, you're very welcome. And we hope that tonight's discussion will raise questions that we'll be debating for many months and years to come. So in a minute, I will hand over to our two speakers, and they'll have about 10 minutes to outline their thinking around this issue. Around the whole issue. So we'll listen to those, and then we will go to group discussion. But while our guest speakers are talking, you might want to share some of your thoughts on chat if you're au fait with the chat function on Zoom. And if you have any questions that you want me to ask to either guest speaker, if you go to the chat function and do them directly to me, that's Phil, and send me the question, then we'll have those for later. So we'll have the 10 minutes from each speaker, time for a group chat in which you'll have some questions to structure your discussion, or you can completely ignore them for those on Zoom and go your own way. And then we'll come back to questions and answers with our speakers. So guest speakers, group chat, Q&As, and as always, we'll be done by 9 p.m. So you'll be all ready for Made in Chelsea. For now, though, we will put the reality loving to one side, reality TV to one side. And instead, he says, reaching for the water, it is a very great pleasure and privilege to welcome Llywelyn to start our proceedings this evening. Yeah, that's enough from me. Llywelyn ap Gwilym, it's over to you. Thanks for coming tonight.
Brilliant. So thanks for asking me to speak tonight, and thanks for the generous, slightly over-the-top introduction. So Phil mentioned expertise in his introduction, but I'm going to be totally honest. I've really been struggling with what to talk about, exploring the positives and perils of patriotism. I've even struggled to decide whether the word to pronounce patriotism or patriotism. What I've settled on is this, which I hope fills the brief and won't send too many of you to sleep. All I'll ask is for you to turn your cameras off to save me the embarrassment if you do. So I'm going to talk a little about what patriotism is, or what I think patriotism is. Then I'll touch on some of the broader perils of patriotism as I see them. And finally, I'll speak about how I think patriotism can be a force for good, specifically in the context of Wales. So I'll try to end on a positive note. So, patriotism and nationalism. I've recently been reading a book called Banal Nationalism by Michael Billig. While first published in 1995, it is still incredibly relevant today. In fact, I think that reading the book has been the cause of my struggle to write a coherent talk, because it's demonstrated to me very clearly how little I really know about the topic. But a lack of credentials didn't stop any of the current crop of UK ministers from doing the jobs they do, so I shan't let it stop me. At the beginning of the book, there's a discussion about the difference between patriotism and nationalism, called Our Patriotism, Their Nationalism, which I think is worth spending a minute or two on. Our loyalties to our nation state can be defended, even praised, it says. Our nationalism is not presented as nationalism, which is dangerously irrational, surplus, and alien. A new identity, a different label, is found for it. Our nationalism appears as patriotism, a beneficial, necessary force. And while some have tried to distinguish between these two concepts, patriotism and nationalism, there is no clear, unambiguous distinction. Some have suggested something along the lines of patriotism being about love of country, while nationalism is about xenophobia or hatred of others. I don't buy this distinction, and neither does Billig. Actually, the distinction seems to come down to the requirement to distinguish between us and them, or rationalism and irrationalism. We are rational patriots. They are irrational nationalists. So what's the key driver of patriotism or nationalism? Well, as just discussed, I think you'd be hard-pressed to make the argument for anything other than exceptionalism. While there are many different aspects to nationalism, the core is an exceptionalism which goes further than differentiating between us and them, but both implicitly and explicitly sets us as better than them. Also worth mentioning, and it tends to underpin this exceptionalism, is an evocation of the past. This was explicit in the Trumpian patriotism of Make America Great Again. It was clear in Vote Leave's mantra of take back control, and it's present in the near constant evocation of the Blitz spirit, Dunkirk, and World War II. So nowhere is the distinction between patriotism and nationalism shown to be more false than here in the UK. Writing in the mid-90s, Billig gives the example of Northern Ireland. To quote at length, in describing political events in Northern Ireland, the British media typically use the term nationalist to describe those who seek to abolish the border between the United Kingdom and Eire, especially if they advocate violence in the pursuit of these aims. The government of the British nation state, by contrast, is not called nationalist, although it too can use force to maintain present national boundaries. Irish nationalism, British patriotism. Or to reference events closer to the present day, those advocating for an independent Scotland are nationalists. Those arguing for the status quo are unionists, never British nationalists. Scottish nationalists, British unionists, patriots. Indeed, I, in my advocacy of independence for Wales, am always a nationalist, never a patriot, even though my position is much closer to the love and rationalism used by some to describe patriotism than is the position of those arguing for a continuation of the status quo. But more of that later. Back to patriotism or nationalism, and now to discuss its perils. I've talked about a distinction between us and them, as well as an evocation of the past as being central to conceptions of patriotism and nationalism. These two concepts are the foundation stones for what Umberto Eco termed fascism, or eternal fascism. Eco, in an essay for the New York Review of Books, coincidentally also published in 1995, argued that the fascist game can be played in many different forms and identified 14 typical features of fascism. Relevant to our current discussion are 3 of those 14 typical features, namely fear of difference, the cult of tradition, and the rejection of modernism, i.e. exceptionalism and an evocation of the past, patriotism, nationalism. Am I over-egging things? I don't think so. Eco wrote that those 14 features cannot be organized into a system. Many of them contradict each other and are also typical of other kinds of despotism or fanaticism. But it is enough that one of them be present to allow fascism to coagulate around it. So we can see that patriotism and nationalism is but a hair's breadth away from fascism, something that we've seen recently in Trump's America, and continue to see in Bolsonaro's Brazil, Modi's India, Putin's Russia, Duterte's Philippines, and May's and Johnson's UK. Taking a moment to focus on the UK, are we really seeing a slide into fascism? I'll let you make up your own minds on this one, but we can certainly identify more than just the 3 typical features already mentioned. See which of these are recognizable. Disagreement as treason, an appeal to social frustration, an obsession with a plot which leaves followers feeling besieged, an enemy which is both strong and weak, life lived for struggle, contempt for the weak which manifests itself in elitism, the cult of the hero, machismo and weaponry, selective populism, and use of an impoverished vocabulary which limits the ability for complex and critical reasoning. An argument can realistically be made for the majority of these features being present in the UK today. But is this situation new? British patriotism nationalism has been a feature ever since I can remember, from the rather benign manifestations of Cool Britannia in the late 1990s and the 2012 London Olympics, to the destructive tendencies of imperial wars of aggression in Iraq, Libya, and Syria. But for me, you only need to look at the British exceptionalism of Brexit, at the way that Johnson's government is ripping up the UK's unwritten constitution, at the constant demonising of the other, whether Europe, migrants, or even the judiciary when they have the temerity to uphold the law, and at the quite unbelievable recent dumbing down of public discourse, to have grounds to be worried that the UK is indeed sliding inexorably from a more typical patriotism nationalism into fascism. And this slide is having an impact right now. When you look at those countries which have fared the worst from COVID, what have they all got in common? The USA, Brazil, Russia, India, the UK. They are all countries toying with fascism. Over 150,000 dead is a testament to our slide towards fascism. So what can be done? I did promise that we would get a bit more positive, so bear with me. What can be done? How can we shield ourselves from this slide towards fascism? Well, this brings me on to the last topic that I'd like to speak about, which is Welsh independence. I'd like to take the opportunity to dispel some myths and misunderstandings, as well as to make the case that this is our best opportunity to protect ourselves from an increasingly polarised and authoritarian environment. I mentioned earlier that I, as well as most others who are actively pushing the cause of self-determination, are tarred with the Welsh Nash moniker and all the baggage that comes with that label. In the usual mainstream distinction between patriotism and nationalism, a distinction which I've argued is false, us nationalists are divisive, wanting to throw up borders, often because of an apparent hatred of the English, while British patriots, unionists, are not, because they want to keep the United Kingdom together. This distinction is actually completely inaccurate. It's incorrect in the characterisation of Welsh nationalists, and it's incorrect in the characterisation of British unionists. British unionists are British nationalists in all but name. I won't go over the ground that we've already tread, but at their most benign, unionists implicitly support the status quo, and at their least benign, support the kind of divisive exceptionalism that we've discussed in depth. So, what about those of us who advocate for independence for Wales? I should add a caveat here. There's no such thing as a monolithic movement for independence, and different people will advocate independence for different reasons. However, I will speak with a broad brush, which I believe captures the majority of views. I would argue that we're not nationalists in any meaningful sense of the word. We don't view Wales or the Welsh as being exceptional in any real, meaningful way. We just don't think that we are any worse than anyone else, not uniquely incapable of managing our own affairs. When it comes to defining us, well, we're pretty flexible in who we are. As Sean Jobbins, the chair of Yes Cymru, stated at the first March for Independence in Cardiff in May 2019, if you're here, you're Welsh. This is certainly no blood and earth nationalism. And when it comes to defining them, well, even though there's probably a little less flexibility here, we just want to join them as just another independent country in a world of independent countries. We don't want to put up borders, and we don't want to raise other barriers, visible or invisible. We don't want to cut ourselves off from England, something we're accused a lot of. We can't change our geography, so it'd be churlish to want to be anything other than best friends with our new neighbours. We just want it to be a relationship between equals. There are many other reasons to advocate for independence, not least the fact that it's the most realistic path to improving the lived experience of people in Wales. And I'll happily expand on this later if there are any questions. But in the context of our current discussion, independence really is a shield against an increasingly reactionary UK. It's a way of fighting back against populism, of showing solidarity with others elsewhere, and of ensuring that a love of country goes hand in hand with a love for, rather than hatred of, others. Diolch.
Fab. Diolch yn fawr, Llewellyn. There's a huge amount that we hopefully will come back to there if time allows. You covered the whole gamut of things and fortunately addressed the issue of patriotism, nationalism far better than I would have done, taken us into the questions of Welsh independence, all with a nuance that 10 minutes shouldn't allow. So we're hugely thankful. I look forward to the discussions that will come later.
Thank you.
For now, over to Ray Vincent, who continues our discussion on the positives and pitfalls of patriotism. And it's a joy for me to say, Ray, you're on mute.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Llewellyn, for that's very, very clear thinking. And actually, I don't know that I disagree with anything that Llewellyn has said. So it's not going to be an argument. But I, having been rather extravagantly described as a biblical scholar, I'm going to think about the approach of the Bible to it and what the Bible has to say about patriotism. I'll start with the story in the book of Genesis, quite near the beginning of the Bible, where God called Abraham to leave his ancestral land behind and promised that he would be the father of a great nation. So there's already there a sort of ambiguity. God's call has to take priority over love of one's own country, and yet God creates nations. And then at the Exodus, the Hebrews, the children of Israel, were rescued from brutal slavery in Egypt and escaped. And they believed very strongly that God had rescued them. And they gloated over the way he had destroyed their enemies. They gloated over the 10 plagues that were inflicted on the Egyptians, including the death of all their firstborn. And then they gloated over the fact that they were miraculously able to cross through the Red Sea on dry land. And when the Egyptians went to pursue them, they were all swallowed up. And then they went into the promised land. God told them that they were his special holy nation. They conquered Canaan, driving out all the other inhabitants. There were at least 7 other tribes living in Canaan at the time, and their job was to defeat them all and drive them out, which they didn't actually do. But this was part of the ideology that inspired probably later Jewish people as they looked back. And then the books of Joshua and Judges go on to tell us stories of how God helped the Israelites against their enemies. And Llewellyn mentioned the cult of the hero, and certainly the book of Judges is rather misnamed because they weren't people sitting in court with wigs on their heads. The judges were basically heroes. They were the ones who rescued Israel from its enemies. They were the legendary heroes whose stories were told to children down through the generations. And the first story of a battle like that in the Book of Judges actually involves 2 women. There was Deborah, we say Deborah today, but I'm sure in those days it was Deborah, who stirred up Barak to rally all the tribes to fight off the Canaanites. And the story ends with another woman, Jael, who invited the enemy commander into her tent and gave him plenty to eat and drink. And while he was sleeping, she drove a stake through his head and killed him. And then, of course, there were the better-known heroes like Gideon and Samson, the strong man. So it's all about machismo, really. It's all about heroes and really violence in the name of God. And then, of course, David eventually established the kingdom and united it. And under him and his son Solomon, the nation had its heyday. And the way that the Bible describes, especially the reign of Solomon, is very interesting. It's really glorying in the past. I'm sure these things were written hundreds of years later, and talking about glorying in the past and evoking the past it was really, really over the top. I'm going to read a few verses from the first book of Kings, chapter 4, which say something about Solomon's reign. There's lots more, but I'll just select those few verses. If I can get my light on. Yeah. The people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the grains of sand on the seashore. They ate and drank and were happy. Solomon's kingdom included all the nations, all the nations, not just their own, all the nations from the river Euphrates to Philistia and the Egyptian border. They paid him taxes and were subject to him all his life. The supplies Solomon needed each day were 5,000 litres of fine flour and 10,000 litres of meal, 10 stall-fed cattle, 20 pasture-fed cattle, and 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and poultry. Solomon ruled over all the world, all the land west of the river Euphrates, from Tifsah on the Euphrates as far west as the city of Gaza. All the kings west of the Euphrates were subject to him, and he was at peace with all the neighboring countries. As long as he lived, the people throughout Judah and Israel lived in safety, each family with its own grapevines and fig trees. Solomon had 40,000 stalls for his chariot horses and 12,000 cavalry horses. His 12 governors, each one in the month assigned to him, supplied the food King Solomon needed for himself and for all who ate in his palace. They always supplied everything needed. And so he goes on and on. And it tells the story, of course, about how the Queen of Sheba, which was presumably a very distant land, heard of the wisdom and the wealth of Solomon and went to visit him to see for herself. And it also goes on to tell us that not only did he have legendary wealth, but he had a legendary harem as well. He had he was married to 700 princesses, which is bound to be an exaggeration. I can't believe there were 700 kingdoms in the near vicinity. And in addition to the 700 princesses, he had 300 concubines. That kept him very busy, I'm quite sure. No doubt an exaggeration, but it was a sign of how rich and powerful he was. But once it mentions those wives and concubines, we begin to see the other side of the story. His foreign wives led him astray to worship other gods in disobedience to the God of Israel, in disobedience to the first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And later we find the effects of his reign, because it was built on slavery and heavy taxation. The old tribes of Israel were broken up, and Israel became a highly organized kingdom divided into regions, just like any other kingdom. There was inequality and oppression. And the result of that was that when it came to the end of Solomon's reign, when he died, there was a huge revolt against his son, and the kingdom was split into two. And then it was downhill all the way. That kind of patriotism and monarchism was not in keeping with the best ideals of Israel. Israel was meant to be a holy people, and a vital part of that was justice. There's a good example of this. If you take Psalm 72, it begins, give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to a king's son. That probably implies that it was a coronation hymn. But note the priority. The king is to be valued by his justice, not by his power or his wealth. And as it goes on, it includes all the things that were traditionally said and wished for a king, all the great hyperbole. May he have dominion from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. May his foes bow down before him and his enemies lick the dust. May all kings fall down before him, all nations give him service. All the usual things, the traditional things, but it gives the reason for this power. It says, for he delivers the needy when they call, the poor and those who have no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy and saves the lives of the needy. So with all its pomp and pageantry, there was that element that made clear that the kingdom is judged by its effect on the poorest of its subjects. There's a saying in the book of Proverbs, which is very, very often quoted, righteousness exalteth a nation. And this is usually assumed to mean that the more people go to church and live respectable lives, the more successful and greater a nation is going to be. But that's not what it means at all. It's a misunderstanding. The word that's often translated righteousness in the Bible really means justice. It's justice that exalts a nation and makes it great. And the prophets were always reminding people of this. Whenever there was gross inequality, whenever there was miscarriage of justice, whenever the poor were exploited, they prophesied that it would end in disaster. Israel might be the chosen people, but that never meant that God was automatically on their side, whether they did right or wrong. If they did wrong, God himself would fight against them. This is something that probably needs to be said in the light of the situation in the Middle East today. The prophet Amos gives two very interesting insights into the idea of a chosen people. He looks at it from both sides, really. In one place, he has God saying, "You only have I known of all the families of the earth." In other words, you are a very special people to me. Therefore, I will punish you for all your iniquities. In other words, God's special people, being God's special people, doesn't mean God is on your side. Doesn't mean you're specially favored. It means that God will expect a higher standard from you. And in another place, he even denies that there is anything unique about Israel, which is very unusual in the Bible, but the prophets were unusual. They all disagreed with other things that people were saying. Amos says, "Are you not like the Ethiopians to me, O people of Israel, says the Lord? Did I not bring Israel up from the land of Egypt?" Oh, yes, that's what they celebrate and still celebrate every year. "Did I not bring Israel up from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir?" The Israelites were so proud that God had rescued them from their slavery in Egypt and brought them into the promised land. But Amos is saying, well, so what? Didn't he bring everybody else into the places where they are? And he then goes on to say, "The eyes of the Lord God are upon the sinful kingdom, and I will destroy it from the face of the earth." So in the Hebrew scriptures, the kind of patriotism that says, my country, right or wrong, is definitely
Oh, he's left us on a cliffhanger. It's definitely what, Ray? It's definitely what? Now we'll see if Ray comes back to us. But if not, I think we were getting near to the end of the 10 minutes. So maybe he'll give us a recap later. Wow. It's been a fun night for technological issues. Okay, we'll keep going, and I think we'll go to the group chat and we'll see what Ray's got to tell us later. Claire, would you mind putting the questions on the screen? And we'll thank Ray and perhaps catch up later. Here are the questions that you're going to be put into two groups in a second. For those on Zoom, for those on YouTube, why not pick up the phone, text a friend, email someone, chat to someone at the bus stop 2 meters distance and ask and discuss these questions. Question 1, are you proud of your nation? Why or why not? Question 2, where do you see patriotism as a force for good or ill in our world today? 3, thinking about some of the issues that have been brought up this evening, how do you view the relationship between patriotism and internationalism, particularly in the light? Oh, I think Ray is back.
Yeah, sorry, but I don't know what happened there. I was just getting to the New Testament. I wasn't just going to talk about the Old Testament.
Well,
I'll be brief as I was doing.
Go for it then, Ray. We'll come back to these questions in a second.
Yes. Still in the Hebrew scriptures, let me, you can see and hear me now, okay, can you? Yeah. There's the vision in the book of Isaiah about the anointed servant of God, whose mission is to bring forth justice to the nations and to be a light to the nations, that God's salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. And that's taken up, of course, in the New Testament, with Jesus saying, go to all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation. And then we find in the letter to the Colossians, Paul saying, there is no longer Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free, but Christ is all and in all. And yet Paul himself was proud of his origin. He was proud of his background as a Jew, of the tribe of Benjamin. He was also proud of his origin in the city of Tarsus, described himself as a citizen of no mean city. He also took advantage of his status as a Roman citizen when it was helpful in helping him to stand up for his rights. But he also came out with that great statement, our citizenship is in heaven. That's where we are really citizens. That is our patriotism should be there. And at the end of the New Testament, we've got this wonderful vision of the heavenly choir, a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages. And that makes me think that the kind of multicultural community that we have in Wales and in other parts of Britain today, which many people see as a problem, is actually a foretaste of heaven. Because in the great heavenly assembly, there'll be all nationalities, all nations and tribes and languages. And it's interesting to note that in that vision, the different nationalities and languages are not abolished. They're still there, joyfully praising God together. And it seems to me there are two kinds of patriotism, which Llewellyn has already hinted at. The wrong kind is the one that assumes that your own nation is superior to others and entitled to rule over them. And very often poor people swallow this just as much as richer people. I think back in the Victorian era, when there was terrible poverty in Britain, even the poorest people were encouraged to feel proud that they belonged to the greatest empire in the world. Karl Marx said that religion is the opium of the people. In some ways, patriotism can be the opium of the people. People who are otherwise poor and underprivileged can be made to feel proud, and it's their leaders who enable them to have that feeling, to make them put up with their poverty. And then there's a good kind of patriotism, which is when we love our traditions, our way of life, and above all, our values. It's a desire to defend and to perpetuate the good things we have. It's a healthy self-respect. And I have actually read Llewellyn's book. Thank you for Llewellyn for making it short. It's given me time to read it. And I think he makes the point that well, I'm going to quote actually, we need to learn our history, not so that we can boast and brag of our superiority, but so that we can leave behind our perceived inferiority. We are equal with others, not superior, not inferior. And that's the good, healthy kind of patriotism.
Well, thank you, Ray. And never let it be said that internet and a bad Wi-Fi will stop Ray from heading us into the New Testament and ending us with a vision of heaven. That is fab, Ray. And I know that some of our Zoomers will be happy that heaven is a multitude of nations. I know some will ask if pets will be there too, but perhaps for another day. One of some of Ray's thinking put me in mind of my favorite quote from the Quran. That it says, "We have created you male and female, made you into tribes and nations, so you might recognize one another." That diversity is a way of bringing us together, helping us to know one another and be in relationship with each other. Anyway, enough from me and from Ray for now. We're going to go back to those questions. We went through 3 of them, and the last one is another quote from the Black Book of the New Wales, which I also recommend. So the quote is, "These are the 3 normative values on which the New Wales will be built: fairness, democracy, and community." A line there from Llewellyn's fab book, bilingual and short, so it's but full of some interesting thinking to get our teeth into. So the question is then, upon which 3 values would you like a post-COVID society to be built, and which political route might be most helpful in enabling this? Already a question that's been sent for Llewellyn will lead us into how independence for Wales might be the best route for a fairer nation. But we'll come on to that in a minute. I won't waffle on because we've lost a bit of time. Instead, Claire will put you into groups. If you're an introvert and you like a bit more time to think before you're shoved in a room with others, feel free to turn your camera off and think through those questions. Otherwise, Claire will put you in the groups, and we'll be back about 25 to 9. So that gives you a good 20 minutes to go through some of those questions or other things that our 2 speakers have brought up. For now, go well, and we'll see you on the other side. But welcome back to our Zoomers. Now we're recording. I hope you had an interesting discussion. Feel free to share some of your thoughts, questions, any feedback on the chat function as we go along. But for now, we've got some questions to our 2 guest speakers who, as I say, covered such a lot in such a short period of time. So no more waffling from me. Question one, and this goes to both speakers. I'll come to Ray first for this one, seeing as you unmuted first, Ray.
Yeah.
Is patriotism, do you think patriotism is on the rise across the world today, or does media coverage make us more aware of it?
I think it's on the rise in the sense of smaller nations because, there's been a big change over the last few decades. The smaller nations are becoming much more recognized. I mean, Wales among them, but I mean, places like Catalonia and the Basque people and the multinational nature of places like Canada and so on, and there's much more recognition of minorities than there used to be.
So there's some positives there as well as the.
I think so. Yeah.
The lurch to the far right. Mm-hmm. How about you, Llewellyn? Do you think that that it's on the rise, or is that something we're picking up, we're more sensitive to?
Yeah, I'm not sure with this one, to be honest. I absolutely recognise what Ray's saying about kind of maybe smaller nations or, historical nations at a sub-state level, maybe finding, patriotism or, a sense of who they are maybe more so. And I think, if you think about Wales and Scotland, or even, Cornwall or Brittany, for example, I think, after the post-war period, there was a great kind of upsurge in British patriotism, or I guess French patriotism. And I think now we're seeing maybe that dissipate somewhat, and we're seeing it bubble up, at that, constituent national level here. I mean, I guess I would worry about saying yes overall, because I think if you go back, over the arc of time, I think, what's the most destructive outcome of, patriotism or nationalism? Well, it's wars. And, we've had, the two of the most destructive, wars I've ever seen, in the last century. And we've seen, almost constant war for the past 20 or 30 years. But, it's always been something that's there, right? In terms of, empire building as far back as you want to go. So I think, I'm not convinced. I think maybe the forms are just changing somewhat.
It's more nationalism that's on the rise, you think, rather than patriotism.
Then you're getting into how do you define the difference between nationalism and patriotism.
Taking us back there. Ray, you're trying to take us back there.
No, never mind.
I'll keep us moving on. And this next question is for Llewellyn specifically, but Ray, feel free to chip in afterwards. We'll start with Llewellyn though. Some might say that they are unionists because it's a matter of class. And Wales leaving the union would leave poorer communities in England in a worse state. So surely it's better to stick together. How would you promote Welsh independence whilst keeping the same core Wales helping England in the union?
Yeah, look, it's a really, really good question, because actually, as I kind of alluded to, right, I support Welsh independence not I don't think from a patriotic or nationalist point of view. And, if you'd have asked me this question maybe, 5-10 years ago, I probably would have been coming at it much more from a patriotic feeling. But actually now it's much more to do with values. And, I don't think that a centralised Westminster government serves our interest in Wales very well. But similarly, if I was in the north of England, if I was in the southwest of England, I would also feel pretty similar, I think. So I absolutely get it. I think, in terms of it being a class issue, I think it is. It's a class issue. It's a capitalism issue. But I guess the question that I'd ask, and it's a question that I think Labour and Welsh Labour have failed to answer in particular, is why necessarily the Welsh working class needs to show solidarity with the English working class, but then the border is drawn at the Channel. We don't show solidarity with the French working class or the Spanish working class. It's absolutely not. It's, despite what Marx said, it's not the, workers of the world unite, it's workers of the UK unite. And I question the need to suffer together. The way I see it, Wales is kind of almost the perfect testing ground for building a better society. It's small enough, but it's also rich enough that you could actually build something much better. And I think once you build something much better, then you can show solidarity across national borders, but you don't need to draw the line at England. You can draw the line much more broadly than that, and try and raise up, the global oppressed as opposed to just the British oppressed.
Thanks, Llewellyn. What do you think, Ray? How would you respond to that question, or Llewellyn's?
I think, well, in a sense, the plight of the poorer areas of England are, in a way, an English problem. We're, ideally, we should be concerned for working class people everywhere. But we have to start where we are and do what's practical, and Wales is a good place to do it. I think some of the most successful nations in the world today are the smallest ones. Places like New Zealand, Singapore. It seems that a small unit can really get itself together and achieve things.
And how much of that do we think is about devolution of power to smaller and smaller groups, or to communities, rather than having one centralized government staffing, looking after great swathes of people?
Devolution of power to smaller units, it does bring government closer to the people. I mean, this is the feeling that I have about Wales at present. Because of devolution, we already feel the government is closer to us. We meet. I've met cabinet ministers, which I've never met any UK cabinet ministers. but I feel closer to the government, and it becomes more of a community. And that's very important, I think. I think that's in Llewellyn's list, isn't it, of the things that was it, democracy, fairness, and community. Democracy is all very well, but if it's all voting for some distant authority, you never some sort of faceless bureaucracy and so on. That's not what we really want. It's community, the sense that we are belonging together, and what we're doing is contributing to, as it were, our own people that we're familiar with, people that we can see that are near to us. I mean, the other side of that, of course, is that we don't care about people who are further away. But I think there's a lot to be said for a smaller nation that has a sense of community about it.
Well, so we're going to have a chance to speak more on this in a minute with the question but one. But for now, Ray, was Jesus a patriot?
I don't know how to answer that question, really. I think, he was definitely a Jew, belonged to the Jewish nation, and I think his ministry was all about being a real Jew, being what a Jew was meant to be. Including everybody in that nation. I mean, his interests were, he was starting where he was, as it were. He wasn't, he was open to Gentiles and Samaritans and so on, but very much so. But his main work was in the Jewish community and dealing with the people on the edge of that community, the lost sheep, as he called it, the house of Israel. And so, yes, he was concerned with building up the family of the nation. So I think in that sense, I don't suppose, well, patriotism, I'm not sure is quite the right word to describe him, but certainly being part of the people, being part of the Jewish people was very important to him.
Which kind of echoes some of your both of what you said earlier about make the society fairer for the people around you, closer to you, and then hopefully those ideals, those values can spread out further afield.
Yes, yes. But those values were open, you know. I mean, Jesus wasn't encouraging the Jews to just stick together and keep everybody else at bay. He was very much encouraging them to love the Samaritans and the Romans, even the enemies.
Mm. Thanks, Ray. I think our final question that we have time for is over to Llewellyn for his thinking on this, and then Ray as well. How would Welsh independence be the path to creating a fairer Welsh society?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think we can assume that everybody wants a better society. So I think that bit we can probably all agree on. I think I'd probably flip the question around and I'd ask, what's the path to a better society under the current constitutional settlement? And if we don't see a path there, then we need to think about alternatives. I mean, you know, England is what, 85% of the population of the UK overwhelmingly votes Conservative, punctuated by brief periods of Labour in power. But even with Labour in power, do people's lived experiences improve? And I'd argue, you know, not significantly, because, you know, where does this kind of voting pattern get to? You know, with the fifth biggest economy in the world. But so what? You know, as Ray mentioned in his introductory talk, right? It's about kingdoms being judged on their effects on the poorest. And, you know, being part of the most ideologically neoliberal states in the world is great if you're in one of the leads. Mm. But actually it's not so good if you're, you know, one of the 25% of Welsh adults living below the poverty line, or a third of Welsh children who live below the poverty line. So, you know, so what if you're part of the fifth biggest economy in the world? So, you know, I'd argue that after, you know, 300 years of union, 800 years of incorporation, you know, we've probably given it long enough. So, you know, what alternatives are there? I mean, devolution, I don't think cuts it. I think, you know, we've seen really clearly from the coronavirus crisis, with the powers that we have, we can do things marginally better around the edges, but it is marginal. It's tinkering in reality, because we have power over so few levers. I think federalism is a non-starter. There's a new book called Englishness, which uses extensive survey data to show that actually there's very little demand in England for constitutional reform like that, which then leaves independence, right? And, you know, I hope that it's come across, and if it hasn't, you know, I'll definitely say it. I don't advocate independence in, you know, kind of a pulling up the drawbridge type of way. You know, I would advocate strongly to share some powers in a confederal setup. But the point there is that ultimately the power lies with us, so that we can make decisions that are best placed for the people of Wales. Talking a very brief point on kind of the point that Ray made about government feeling closer to us given devolution. I think that's true to an extent. I think it's true to the extent if you live in Southeast Wales. I think actually the Senedd seems a very long way if you live up in, you know, Penllyn or Morn or Wrexham. So actually, you know, one of the things that I do advocate absolutely is devolution within an independent Wales to the lowest practical level, because I think, you know, ultimately I'm best placed to make decisions about myself, and, you know, communities are best placed to make decisions about them. And it's only when those decisions affect greater numbers of people or you know, bigger communities is when I think we need to start thinking about that higher level. So I think, you know, for me, independence absolutely does not guarantee a better society. Like 100% it doesn't guarantee it. And the real risk is that we just remake the inequality of the current UK in a new Wales. But I think what independence does give us is the vehicle for doing things drastically different to what currently happens, but also what is currently possible within the UK, so that we can really begin to remake society for better.
Yeah.
So it allows for the possibility for that fairer society. Ray, do you want to
no, I don't think I need to add much to that, really. I think I can see that point and agree with it. Yeah.
Well, we'll leave that hanging for others to take where they want. Final question to both of you. Having said we'd have a final one. If we want to learn more about the issues we've been talking about, whether that's patriotism, whether that's the Christian view on it, whether that's Welsh independence, all of this kind of thing, apart from the Black Book of the New Wales, Llywelyn's excellent book, which Ray and I have read and recommend, where else might we go to learn more? Ray, as you're off mute, do you want to share any places you books in the Bible?
I didn't think of thinking this out beforehand.
Well, we'll come back to you then in case something flies into your head as Llywelyn's speaking.
There is a book I've read recently by I think he's an African, and he's the grandson of Sir Stafford Cripps, who used to be Chancellor of the Exchequer back in the 1940s. His name is Kwaku something, I think, but I forget the title and the name of it. And it's a book about identity, and about different tribes and nations and cultures, and some of the myths that there are about them. If you give me a few minutes, you carry on for a minute. I'll check and see if I can find the actual title of the book.
We shall, Ray, we shall. Thanks. And Llywelyn?
I'm not sure I'll fill a few minutes. I have two suggestions, which I've already mentioned. So Banal Nationalism by Michael Billig, I'll put it in the chat. I think it is really excellent, because I think it's maybe a little bit theoretical, but it talks a lot about nationalism and patriotism. And what it really talks about is kind of not the overt nationalism or patriotism, kind of the flag flying that you see, but much more about the banal nationalism, as the title suggests, right? It's more about the flag flying on the building as opposed to the flag being waved, or the language that we use, which I thought was very interesting. And then the other one I would suggest is the essay by Umberto Eco, because I do really, really worry that we're, not just us, but I think a large proportion of the world is sliding to a very, very, very dark place. And actually it's by, people in general recognizing that. I think that's how we tend to avoid sliding further. So those are the two.
Thanks, Llywelyn. And you filled that time wonderfully with those recommendations. Ray?
I found that book, yes. It's by Kwame Anthony Appiah, and it's called The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity. I found that a very stimulating book about not just about nationalism and patriotism, but about culture generally, and how people identify themselves with a culture and makes them against other cultures and so on. It's a very interesting book.
Great, thanks for that, Ray.
The Lies That Bind.
Sounds interesting. Yeah. Worth waiting for. Okay. So with that, it leaves me to bring tonight to a close. So a huge thanks to Claire for facilitating the evening, for Bethan for putting publicity out with the correct link. That was not on Bethan. Thanks to the Zoomers who went on the treasure hunt and got here, and to you on YouTube for joining the discussion, and feel free to WhatsApp us and start conversations all over the place. And finally, a huge thanks to Llywelyn and Ray for sharing your thoughts tonight. I know from the looks on faces and from the messages I've got that it sparked a lot of debates, and I'm sure it will roll on this side of the border, and as we've got a few English friends here on that side as well. So a huge thank you, Ray and Llywelyn. And as always, we give a donation to the local food bank on behalf of our speakers, and Llywelyn has very kindly offered to match it. So we're very grateful for that too. So this is our last Double Vision evening for this run. We hope to be back in the autumn. If you have particular topics that you'd like us to cover, or you know some wonderful speakers who will be willing to offer 90 minutes of their time plus prep, let us know, and that will be fab to come back and continue the conversations. For now, I thought I'd end with a few words from someone who wove together his Christian faith and his Welsh nationalism, the famously, wonderfully grumpy R.S. Thomas, whose poem, The Bright Field, might speak to patriots and priests alike, and it's one of my faves. I have seen the sun break through to illuminate a small field for a while, and gone my way and forgotten it. But that was the pearl of great price, the one field that had treasure in it. I realize now that I must give all that I have to possess it. Life is not hurrying on to a receding future, nor hankering after an imagined past. The turning aside like Moses to the miracle of the lit bush, to a brightness that seemed as transitory as your youth once, but is the eternity that awaits you. Perhaps with raised visions of heaven as that multicultural, multinational place, that might be the vision we hold in our hearts. So go well, seek out the miracles that are all around us. Go give your all for that bright field. I think Pam and Val might be in it right now. And hopefully we'll see you all in the autumn for some more Double Vision discussions. So keep well, and we'll see you soon. Bye for now.
Okay, bye-bye.